Welcome back to one of these video lectures, class. And today we're going to be talking again, about the contexts. We keep talking about the contexts for Paul and understanding both the Roman context, the Greek cultural context, his Jewish context, and what we're talking about today is the non-Jewish religious context for the first century Roman world. Paul lived in the diasporic Jewish community in the wider Roman world, in the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean. And as such, he lived in a world that was peopled with many, many peoples and many, many of those people's gods. And so let's talk about the non-Jewish religion, because this affects his teaching to the non-Jewish Jesus followers to whom he wrote his letters. So questions. First, I'd like you to start with a little bit of something for me, please. I'd like you to write down, take 5 minutes. I'd like you to pause this presentation, take 5 minutes and write down on a sheet of paper, what are 3 or 4 ingredients necessary for a movement to be defined as a religion? In our day and age now, if you were to start a new religion, what would be 3 or 4 necessary ingredients before you think it could be defined as a religion in our day and age? And if you get a chance or you want some inspiration, there's a little video here about Pastafarianism that I've included a link to. I find Pastafarianism a very interesting discussion that's brought up about what constitutes a so-called valid religion. So stop the video, take some time and write down 3 or 4 ingredients necessary for a movement to be defined as a religion, and then I'll see you next slide. Hi, welcome back. I think that some of the things that you may have come up with, I'm not sure, that a religion to be properly defined as a religion has to have a belief system. We think that generally in the 21st century, that there needs to be a belief system to explain the world and our place in it, a way of understanding who we are in relationship to the world. Very, very often there has to be a supreme being. In the slide behind this, or the picture behind this slide, you see the Pastafarian, the great spaghetti monster with the meatballs reaching out to touch Adam. There needs to be a requirement of exclusive devotion to that supreme being, perhaps. Not sure, not in every world religion now, but at least in many of them, there needs to be this exclusive devotion to a supreme being. There is often a requirement to believe and accept a set of dogmas or a creed. Especially Protestant Christian faiths tend to have a creedal formations, as does Catholicism. And a requirement to believe and to accept a set of dogmas is often part of a faith. An ethics morality that goes along with the faith to determine how we behave. If you are religious in a certain way, then you act in a certain way, or you are supposed to act at least in a certain way. So there's a requirement to ethics or morality that is attached to many, many religions now, and generally we consider to be part of a religious system. Most often there's a community of fellow believers with whom you gather together in some way, whether virtually or not. Even the Pastafarians, they get together and they have meetings together and wear the colanders on their heads. A set of worship practices. What do you do in terms of worship? Is there some specific set of worship practices and other things maybe you've thought of? And what I'd like you to note is how important the action of belief is to many, many of the characteristics that we have identified in the 21st century that we tend to identify as making for a valid religion. Belief is a really big part of that to our minds. What do you believe and how do you believe and what are you able to sign on to, so to speak, in terms of a creedal formulation? So those tend to be our contemporary definitions of religion. Well, let's go back. Almost none of these criteria applied to religions in the ancient world. First century religions didn't care what you believed. That's one of the things that's hardest for us to understand. I think that probably my picture blocked that out. I'm sorry for that. First century religions didn't care what you believed, apart from Judaism, I'll say. Religion in the first century was never private, but always public. So 2 of the major things that we define as religious, caring what we believe, and the importance of a personal faith, these things were just simply not a part of almost any religion, maybe any religion, at least one of them in the first century Mediterranean world in which Paul lived and worked and taught, and in which Jesus lived and worked. First century religions cared if you carried out your ritual obligations, which were especially sacrifice and oaths and other things, but especially those. So it wasn't so much what you believed as what you did. Now, the picture on the left is from Pompeii, and this is the a bull is being led to a priest or a priestess, it's hard to tell, and the person with that hammer, the mallet, is about to sacrifice that bull. And so that's a public sacrifice, and this is a public altar in Pompeii, a picture I took a couple of years ago. So again, first century religions didn't care what you believed, they cared what you did. It was never private, it was always public. At issue was not belief. Everyone knew, so there's a quote from Paula Fredrickson in the book Paul, which is our textbook, or one of our textbooks. At issue was not belief. Everyone knew that these superhuman powers existed, but the public display of respect. Did you carry out the necessary public display of respect? Ancient religions, other than Judaism, didn't care about ethics, particularly. I mean, there may have been ethical considerations, but not generally. Ancient religions were not missionary movements because it made no sense to them. You couldn't convert any more than you could change the place where you were born. Philosophical schools, however, were both missionary-minded and cared about ethics. So a lot of the things that we tend to think of now as being characteristics of religion were in the first century characteristics of philosophical schools. If you were a Stoic, if you were a Platonist, if you were something else, these schools, an Epicurean, these things made a difference to your ethics, and they could be missionary-minded. But your religion simply came with your place of birth and your place of residence in the ancient world. So why are we talking about all of this? It helps to set the situation for what we talk about when we talk about Paul and Paul's letters. In the first century, it was a state religion with city and household religions as well. A magical world populated by human communities and their gods and their ethnic gods. A crowded world. For every person, there was that person's god, there were many, many levels of gods, of city gods and semi-divine beings and divine beings and so on. No such thing as private spirituality, as I've mentioned. Many cults and religions, but most were related to cities or nations. And unlike today's religions, most of which, or many of which, the major global faiths in the 21st century claim to be global and are in fact global. Widespread tolerance of other people's beliefs in the first century, but no such thing as atheism. In fact, it was probably almost hard to understand. I mean, different levels of belief or practice, but attachment to your God was something like modern extreme nationalism or sports team fever. If you have a sports team and you say, well, I'm simply in a Canadian context, a Saskatchewan Roughriders fan or something like that. State-sponsored religious festivals. These were chances for you to display your public support of the deity of your city or of your area. Religions were almost never missionary-minded because you were born into a religion. You were not converted to it. You almost could not be converted because you cannot change religion. Religion is part of your DNA from being from a place. So here, interestingly, you have a coin from around the time of Jesus with the likeness of Caesar Augustus, and the Latin inscription says, Augustus, son of the divinized Caesar. Now, if Julius Caesar, the adopted father of Augustus, was a god, then what does that make Augustus? Be ready to talk about that. If the adopted father of Augustus was a god, son of the divinized Caesar, then what does that make Augustus? Let's go to the next slide. Gods everywhere and no missionary impulse. There were dedicated festivals celebrating seasons and days sacred to divine patrons, celestial and imperial, punctuated the civic year. The civic year had festivals all the time. So in Rome, in Paul's life, and in the cities where Paul moved, in Ephesus and in Corinth and elsewhere, there were always these civic festivals going on, and each civic festival had a divine patron. And you were I said earlier that you were attached to one God by your birth, but you were supposed to honor other gods as well. If you happened to be in that city, you gave proper respect to that God as well. The venues of these celebrations, the theater, the circus, the stadium, the amphitheater, held altars to and images of these gods. And so you were constantly passing by. If you were walking through an ancient city, think of them almost like billboards in a modern city downtown. You were constantly passing by images of these divine beings or semi-divine beings, or inscriptions toward them. Celebrations of the family. If you went home, there were gods also in niches in your home. Celebrations of the family, marriages, the father's genius, a child's passage to adulthood, also invoked and honored presiding deities. The gods were everywhere, not only in the public and private buildings of ancient municipalities, but also on insignia of office and on military standards. And a quote from Paula Fredrickson, from Paul Within Judaism. So here are some primary texts. If you didn't think that this applied to Paul, read these texts. Just take a minute now and turn off or pause the presentation and read these texts, especially the yellow highlighted passages, and see if these don't say something about Paul's view of the crowded divine world of his first century. And then I'll see you next slide. To each region and city its own god. This is a photo taken when I was in Pompeii. And this is the inside of a large house, a very large house. And that niche that you see on the right-hand side would have been for the statues or statue of the familial god of the family idol. And this was just common. And the mosaics or the paintings around would have portrayed other gods, the god of Pompeii, the gods of the city, the Roman gods. Paul was a polytheist. What does that mean? People might go, my God, no, he was a monotheist, of course. He was Jewish, of course, a monotheist. But in the ancient world, everyone was polytheistic in the sense that they all acknowledged the existence of many types of divine and semi-divine beings. And think again about those passages last slide that Paul wrote. He certainly believed or knew that there were many, many gods and semi-divine beings, but that only one was important for him, and that was the God of Israel, and only one Lord, he said, which was Jesus Christ. So everyone in the ancient world was polytheistic in the sense that they acknowledged the existence of many types of divine and semi-divine beings. It was just a fact of life for them. Like other pious Jews, however, Paul worshipped only one, the God of Israel, and this is this household shrine. To remember about first century religion, this is a mosaic from Pompeii. It's interesting to see the dress and to see that it's all males here with beards who are debating something. Polytheism, not monotheism. The contemporary conception of monotheism, that there is only one God and nothing else exists, was foreign in the first century, even to Jews. And we can talk more about that. Regular required cultic acts rather than belief and ethics. So in other words, just to reinforce that point, ancient religions didn't care what you believed. They cared what you did. The question of belief was sort of beside the point. I mean, it didn't matter what you believed. Did you sacrifice regularly? Did you give proper obedience? Did you leave the food for the household god? Did you say the oath in the proper way? Say a prayer in the proper way? The emphasis in first century religion was on present life rather than afterlife. There was, in many cases, there were fairly dim conceptions of what was an afterlife. There were ideas about afterlife, but they were not strong necessarily, not as in Judaism and certainly in Christianity developed. It was a tolerant and non-exclusive devotion, a little idea that anyone could be right or wrong. So in other words, you didn't go, I worship Osiris and you worship Dionysius, you're wrong. It was simply, you are a Dionysian and I worship Osiris. It was expected that different people should have different gods. And all of this is important for understanding Paul, because remember, what is Paul doing? Paul is calling non-Jewish pagans, non-Jewish Gentiles, to worship the God of Israel. This is a brand new thing, or a very new thing, at least in the ancient world. Paul is calling them away from the worship of their traditional gods. And this is part of why the early Jesus movement aroused such hostility in the Roman and Greek cities. Here is again another slide that I took in Pompeii, a really well-preserved fresco, which shows a household event going on, and there is a god, simply a semi-divine being, who is standing in the audience amongst the humans and watching what is going on in the I think it was a bridal procession, probably the mosaic. This is not from, this slide is not from Pompeii, but from Bath in England. And these are holding up the columns. Plurality rather than exclusive worship. Household shrines would honor the family's guardian spirit or genius. That's where that term comes from. The guardian spirit of the family is the genius of that family, as well as household gods or lares. Public spaces such as this bath, I said in Pompeii, but I think it's in Bath, were also adorned with municipal gods or semi-divine beings. And that's it. I wanted to tell you all about this because when we study Paul, we really need to understand some of the problems that he encountered in trying to call people away from their household gods to the worship of the God of Israel. The problems he had on the one side with the non-Jewish authorities of these cities like Ephesus and elsewhere, and on the other side with the Jewish communities, because he was doing something that Jews had not previously done. People were welcome into the synagogues, they were welcome to worship the God of Israel, but there was no expectation prior to that amongst Jews that these non-Jews should give up worship of their own civic gods. Paul comes along and he changes all of that, and it's really the beginnings of that Jesus movement that have influenced everything since. Thank you for this presentation. I'll see you again.